A man who counted silence, each second hiding a secret. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host Urvela. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing this community grow. Now the mystery begins. A raw February wind prowled along Baker Street that morning, hunting drafts beneath doors and setting the window panes rattling in their frames. Holmes had thrust the poker deep into the grate until the coals glowed a murderous orange, and he lay stretched at length upon the settee, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, like some ascetic contemplating the passions of mankind through a veil of tobacco smoke. It was 10 o'clock when the bell sounded. Once, with a decisive hand that belonged neither to the uncertain poor nor to the valeted rich, but to that intermediate class which has learned to announce itself in a tone of practiced urgency. "Lestrade," Holmes murmured without opening his eyes. "You have heard his step, then?" said I. "I smell his cuff, Watson. Carbolic and wet wool." The Yard's habit of washing ink from its fingers with crude antiseptic is a fashion Lestrade has lately adopted. And as for the damp sleeve, he came on foot despite the weather, for he has been turned back thrice by hansoms occupied by city men, which suggests a day when finance is agitated. There is a disturbance at the exchange, therefore, and where money is troubled, the Yard is never far behind. The door opened before I could answer. Lestrade entered, slimmer and more bird-like than ever in his tightly buttoned coat, hat clutched in one hand, a folded paper in the other. He glanced at Holmes's recumbent figure, shifted, decided to abandon ceremony, and came straight to the fire. "It's murder we've got, Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble. "A nasty, singular business in Bloomsbury. The Commissioner thinks, well, he thinks you'll hear of it whether we bring it or not." Holmes sat up as if a string had drawn him. "Singular, you say? Pray be as brief or as long as the case requires, Lestrade." "The victim is Mr. Septimus Vale," Lestrade began. "You may know the name. Partner in Prentice and Vale, a discount house with its fingers in half the loans of the Empire." "I know the name. And I know the man," Holmes replied. "Tall fellow with the pallor of indoor money, a taste for plain cravats, and a curious contempt for conversation unless he is leading it." Lestrade blinked. "You've met him?" "Observed him," said Holmes. "Proceed." "Killed in his study this morning between 6 and 7, Lestrade continued. "His manservant found him at 7:30, locked in from the inside, the fire out. The room cold as a crypt, though the rest of the house was warm. There's no mark on him save a faint bruise at the base of the skull. The doctor says it might have been a blow or might have come after. We can't place the weapon, no sign of struggle. Windows fastened, chimney too narrow for a sweep, and no one in or out by the front after the manservant barred it at 11. "A locked room," I said. "But the bruise, surely there must have been—" "Wait," Lestrade cut in with a grimace that conceded the impossibility had only begun. On the desk was a notebook, the top page written in the neatest hand, lines of numbers, columns, and little dashes, as if he were keeping a tally of— He searched for a word and found none. Of nothing at all. Over the page he'd written, "This." He unfolded his paper and handed it to Holmes. Upon the sheet, in clerkly characters with a delicate upward slant, ran a heading, "Silence, number 47." Below it were 3 columns, each a ladder of figures descending the page. In the left column were seconds, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 5, such disconnected measures as a child might chant in a game. The middle column bore times annotated as if from a watch, 6:12, 6:14, 6:16, and the right a series of tiny strokes grouped in fives like tally marks. Holmes's eyes brightened. He held the sheet in his long fingers, not reading so much as listening with them. "Silence, number 47, he repeated softly. "Curious. Vale had a taste for numbering the absences of sound." "Continue, Lestrade." "There's more," said the inspector. "The mantel clock, a great bracket thing with a glass door, had been stopped. Not wound down, stopped. And the bell of it—" He hesitated, and I noticed a small war between his practical soul and the word he must utter. The bell of it had a wad of felt stuffed under the hammer so that it would not chime. Holmes gave a little sigh of contentment, such as a hungry man might when the first dish is set before him. "So," he said, "Mr. Septimus Vale, a man to whom silence was of account, contrived silence in his own chamber by gagging his clock and murdering his fire. Pray tell me the remainder. The housekeeper heard nothing in the night." The manservant swears he set the fire in the study at 5:30 as usual and brought hot water at 6. The door was locked then. He thought nothing of it. Mr. Vale often bolted himself in to write. At 7:30 the bell in the study was rung twice as a signal for his tea. When no answer came to the tray, the manservant fetched the housekeeper, forced the lock with a coal hammer, and found him in his chair at the desk, head a little to one side, eyes open, quite gone. "Ah," Holmes murmured. The bell rang at 7:30. By whom? We cannot say. The bell pull goes straight to the servants' passage. The wire runs behind the study wall. There's nothing to show whether Mr. Vale pulled it before, or whether— Lestrade coloured, or whether it was pulled after somehow. Holmes tossed back the sheet and sprang to his feet. "Watson, your boots. Lestrade, you have a cab?" "In the street." "Then we shall do you the courtesy of using it." He reached for his coat, paused, and turned to the inspector with that air of negligent exactitude which was as maddening to his opponents as it was comforting to his friends. "Two trifles before we go. First, what became of the felt from the clock's bell?" "It was still there." "And second, what number precedes silence number 47? Lestrade frowned. "You mean whether he kept a series of these?" "I mean precisely that. There are other notebooks in the desk. I didn't look through them." Holmes's lip twitched. "That neglect will save you the trouble of contradicting yourself later. Come." The wind slapped us as we descended the steps, and the cab-horse tossed his head as if objecting to the business. Bloomsbury, in that grey hour when respectable breakfast smoke begins to rise, has a scholarly melancholy that sits poorly upon tragedy. We drew up before a sober house of clean brick, its ironwork glossy with careful oiling. Inside, a housekeeper with reddened eyes received us, while the manservant, tall, rigid, and so meticulously groomed one might have taken him for a figure cut from black paper, stood with his hands knotted behind his back, as if to keep them from shaking. Holmes gave them each a look which took the measure of their grief and their capacity for deception in a single glance. "Mrs. Draper," he said to the housekeeper, "you will forgive the intrusion upon your sorrow. Mr. Vale was a man of habits. We must tread upon them if we are to follow his last." "Sir," she whispered. He was particular." "And Mr. Finch," Holmes addressed the servant, "you wound the clocks?" "Every night, sir, at 9. Last night as well?" "Yes, sir." "Except the study clock, which you left unfettered and ringing in vain until someone smothered it." "Your face tells me you did neither." "I would never, sir." "Good, that leaves us the murderer and Mr. Septimus Vale himself as candidates. You see, Watson, how fair I am." He passed into the study. It was a room of order without warmth, a writing table placed square to the window, ledgers stacked with geometric precision, a great map of the world shaded to show railways and telegraph lines, and upon the mantel the bracket clock with its gilt face looking out through glass like a drowned thing through ice. The fire had indeed been raked to death. The grate was packed with a black cake of cinders that must once have burned with vigour. The air retained a faint odour of extinguished coal, an acrid, suffocating note that seemed to nibble at the back of the throat. Holmes moved as a musician might among instruments. He opened the clock and with long tweezers extracted the piece of felt. He sniffed it, touched it to his tongue with a swift, bird-like motion, and placed it in his pocketbook. He knelt and examined the bell-pull where it disappeared behind wainscoting, then drew a line with his finger across the desk blotter and held the finger up to the light. "Dust tells time as truly as any watch," he said. "Observe, Watson, this strip is clean where an object lay, a notebook, perhaps the very one. And here, what do you make of this?" On the blotter, faint but legible, were impressed the letters SILENCE, written with the heavy pressure of a man accustomed to making his marks count. Below them a hurried scrawl, 6:28, street falls quiet. 31 clock silenced. Title fire dead. 6:37 breath. Holmes bent close. The last word broke off as if the hand that wrote it had been checked by something soft and final. "Lestrade," he said very gently, "you will summon your doctor again and ask him to attend to the small marks at the corners of the mouth and beneath the jaw. He will find them, I think, if he looks for the signs of a constriction that leaves little bruise. Compression of the lower face by a broad cloth leaves fewer protests than a hand." "You mean he was smothered?" Lestrade exclaimed. "I mean only that sound was forbidden here, sound of the hour. Sound of the fire, sound of the victim. Mr. Septimus Vale counted the silence, and then someone helped him reach a sum he could not survive. But it is not my habit to conclude upon the threshold. He straightened, eyes suddenly far away. "Watson, do you hear that?" "I hear nothing." "Precisely. And yet at this hour there is always the muffin man 2 streets over, and a milk cart with a lame wheel that complains like a cat. London is a mighty orchestra. Even its rests are written. This," he gestured to the window, "is not the natural pause. Someone arranged it. How can a man arrange the silence of a street?" I protested. Holmes smiled with that mixture of vanity and kindness which made him, in his best moments, almost humanly lovable. "By choosing the bar of the music. By paying the players to set down their instruments. We shall ask the cabman at the corner whether they were turned away. We shall ask the lamplighter if he was told to keep his tongue. Above all, we shall consult those who listen for a living. Who are they?" "The telegraph men," said Holmes. "For Mr. Septimus Vale wrote, 'Silence number 47,' as a man who measures not the absence of words but the pause between them. We shall look for the one place where silence speaks in code." He closed the clock's glass front with a click that seemed to slice the morning in 2. "Come, Lestrade, we have a murderer who has practiced an art I admire almost as much as I despise its purpose. Let us see how many pieces he lifted from London's great board to make his quiet. The telegraph office in Montague Street keeps early hours, and we had the good fortune to find the shutters up and the brass rail inside the counter, polished to a melancholy gleam by some industrious hand. A pale young man with inked cuffs and a little nick in his left." Here Holmes's glance missed nothing, looked up from a ledger and blinked at the 3 of us with the vacant serenity of one who has already given his day to the Empire's messages. "Good morning," Holmes said, with a courtesy that always struck the right chord in such places. "We are inquiring in connection with a death whether a period of silence was ordered upon any of your circuits between 6 and 7 o'clock this morning." At the word silence, the young man's eyelids flickered. "Silence, sir?" Holmes leaned his elbow upon the rail. "You have codes for such matters. Silence numbered this and silence numbered that. Pray consult the book." The clerk hesitated, took his cue from the inspector's card upon the counter, and reached for a dog-eared volume. His finger ran down a column. "Yes, sir. Silence number 47 is an instruction to clear a circuit for testing or for government traffic. It may be imposed by the district inspector. We had such an order upon the Holborn, Bloomsbury loop this morning at 6:31. It lasted," he consulted another sheet, "until 6:37. Holmes's head inclined a fraction. "And who signed the order?" "Inspector Greaves, sir." "Of this district?" "Yes, sir." Holmes's hand moved out with the deftness of a conjurer. "And how comes it that Inspector Greaves was in Charing Cross from 5 to 9, drinking bad coffee with a general whose staff was shipping off to Aldershot?" He set upon the rail a small pasteboard stamped with red ink, a platform voucher. Where it had lain, a smear of brownish resin marked the brass. The clerk's mouth opened. I don't know, sir." The message came through in the usual way. The stamp looked proper. We obeyed it. Holmes turned away with a little hum of satisfaction, as a musician might when a troublesome phrase finally falls true beneath the fingers. On the pavement outside he consulted his watch. 6:31 to 6:37, he murmured. Our numbers in Mr. Vale's neat hand matched like teeth in a gear. He was counting official silences. Why should a financier concern himself with such things? I asked. For the same reason a sailor studies the tide table, Holmes returned. There are currents in information as powerful as any in water. A man who knows when London's speech pauses may launch his craft to catch the first rush when it resumes. He rapped upon the side of the cab. To the corner by Russell Square. At the square he dismissed the cabman and set off at a brisk pace, drawing us in his wake from one humble sentinel of the morning to another. The muffin man, when we found him setting down his tray in a meagre doorway, had not called in Vale Street at his usual quarter. No, sir, he said, touching his cap. A gent with a high collar and a soft voice met me by the lamp-post yonder and bought the lot. Said there was fever in the street and the doctor had ordered quiet. Paid me double. Holmes noted the coins and returned one, turning the other in his fingers before slipping it into his pocket. Later, by the horse trough, he questioned a milkman whose lame cartwheel was as characteristic as a tune. The fellow swore that he had taken the long way round at a man's request, for there was a lady ill and asleep between 6 and 7. The lamplighter, met at his rest with his pole across his knees, told the same tale in another dress. Kept me talking, he did, sir, about the gas pressure, me, while the street was black as my hat. Was it the same gentleman? Holmes asked each in turn. Couldn't rightly say, the muffin man replied. Only he smelt of varnish. The milkman. Gloves he wore, new ones, left a kind of squeak. The lamplighter, a stick with a knob, made a little click on the curb as he tapped it. Holmes's eyes took on that inward glow I had come to know too well to mistake. He guided us back to Vale's house, and in the study he bent once more over the great clock, examining not only the felt he had pocketed, but the little residue of dust and oil in the crevice beneath the bell. He stretched out his hand without looking round. Your lens, Watson? I passed it, and he peered as a jeweller does, smiling faintly. Shellac, he said. There is your varnish, and along the bell hammer. Do you see that faint brown smear? Gutta percha. A man accustomed to handling insulated wire. His gloves were new, because the resin had not yet worked itself off them. His stick, would be a tester's rod, I think. The click upon the curb was not bone or ivory, but hard rubber, which rings in a very singular way when it touches stone. You are suggesting, I began. I am tracing a profession, he cut in gently. Our murderer is not a gentleman at large, nor a jealous clerk. He is a man who can forge an inspector's order well enough to fool a district office, who knows where to place a wad to silence a bell in a bracket clock, and who can plan a 6-minute vacuum in the noise of a London street as neatly as a surgeon clamps an artery. He straightened, his long forefinger tapping the mantel. He is a telegraph man, or one who has bought a telegraph man. Lestrade, who had hovered with the injured patience of officialdom in a private sitting room, glanced from the clock to the desk and back. And the room locked from within? Holmes crossed to the desk and slid open a drawer, where his search disclosed nothing more exciting than wafers, sealing wax, and a small polished block of metal with a hinged arm. A paperclip of an improved sort, I supposed, until he pressed the arm and the thing clicked to life like an insect, and a little lever sprang up. You see, he said, Mr. Vale loved devices. The bell-pull wire runs behind the wainscoting. A nimble hand with a length of fish wire could hook it and ring from outside the room at his leisure, and this, he held up the block, has left upon the blotter a faint pressure mark in the very place where the notebook lay. Our unknown set his stage, smothered every witness but the cold one, and departed, leaving the bell to be rung at 7:30 to give a false impression of life within the hour. You believe he was gone before 7? I asked. I believe he was gone at 6:37, when London found its voice again. He slipped the device back and shut the drawer with a delicate forefinger. There remains the question, why should a man who can command silence wish to silence Mr. Septimus Vale? Let us bring in the living who knew him. We had them in one by one. Mrs. Draper, the housekeeper, with her swollen lids, Mr. Finch, the tall servant whose hands had learned to be motionless, and, within the hour, Mr. Lucian Prentice, partner in the house of Prentice and Vale, whose clean-jawed face and perfectly fitting coat gave out that odorless scent of prosperity, which is as unmistakable as musk. Holmes sat very still while each told the tale of habits and temper. Vale kept no mistress, drank no more than a stiff water at supper, and had quarrelled with no servant. But at the name of Prentice, Holmes's eyes sharpened the merest hair. Mr. Prentice, he said at last, idly turning the forged silence order we had obtained from the telegraph office beneath his finger, if I asked you for the name of any person in your circle with influence in the post office, whose name would you give? Prentice's smile did not alter, but the muscles about it tightened as a violin's strings do when the peg turns. Influence, Mr. Holmes. Our house is respectable. We have customers among contractors and government brokers. We know, as any large house must, the gentlemen whose departments we serve. But influence, no. Then you will not know, Inspector. Grieve, Holmes said softly, who, while drinking coffee at Charing Cross, placed his hand this morning upon the throat of a London circuit from 6:31 to 6:37. For an instant the clean jaw clenched. It was the smallest flinch, but Holmes's face lit as if at a private jest. I know of him, Prentice conceded. Every trader who uses the wire does. But we have no relationship. No, Holmes agreed. You do not purchase silence. You merely profit when it occurs. Prentice's glance flicked to Lestrade and back. Is that an accusation? It is an observation. Holmes rose. One more and you are free. Did Mr. Vale keep a telegraph sounder in this room? Prentice looked honestly astonished. A sounder? In his study. My dear sir, he despised the clatter. He had reports brought by hand at quarter hours. He said men should talk to him in words, not in clicks. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you. That will be all for now. When the door had closed behind the partner, he stood a long moment with his hands deep in his pockets, swaying a little upon his toes. He lies badly, he said at last. About the sounder? I asked. About the words, Holmes replied. He drew out the felt again and held it to the light. Our dead man did not despise the clatter. He counted it. Somewhere in this house a little tongue of steel spoke the language he was learning to hear, and silence number 47 was his lesson book. Find me the instrument, Watson, and we shall hear what it heard at 6:37. Holmes wasted no further time upon speculation. He was already pacing the study with quick, precise steps, his gaze darting along cornices, shelves and mouldings, with the restless curiosity of a hound upon a scent. I knew the signs well. The case had pierced that peculiar region of his mind, where deduction ceased to be mere analysis and became a kind of hunger. Lestrade, with his notebook half withdrawn, watched in sullen acquiescence. He had long since learned that Holmes's wanderings, however eccentric, were seldom without fruit. Holmes paused at the far wall where a cabinet of books stood flush against the wainscoting. He ran a fingertip along the spines, muttering titles under his breath: economics, railway schedules, telegraph manuals. His hand stopped at a thin volume bound in dark green cloth. With the gentlest tug, he drew it forward, and the whole case shifted a fraction, revealing that it was hinged like a door. Behind lay a narrow recess no larger than a writing slope, and within, upon a small shelf, sat a squat black instrument, of brass and steel, its wires vanishing through a bored hole in the panel. A telegraph sounder, silent now but still bearing upon its key the faint smudges of oil and dust. There, Watson, Holmes said softly, as though addressing a patient. Our friend did not despise the click. He studied it in secret. I leaned forward, marveling at the ingenuity of the concealment. The wires had been painted the same shade as the wall, and a careless observer would never have marked their passage. Holmes's fingers danced over the device, and he bent his ear close. No spring fracture, no jamming. The circuit was active as late as dawn. You see the little paper strip still curled upon the wheel. He was recording, and here, he lifted the slip delicately with tweezers, a run of marks at precisely 6:31, then 6 minutes of white silence until the scratching resumes at 6:37. He was transcribing the official silence even as it fell upon him. Lestrade gave a low whistle. Then the man was keeping tally of messages, government, banking, what have you, spying, by thunder. Holmes closed the recess with a swift push, his eyes narrowing. Not spying, Lestrade, observing. The difference is subtle but profound. A spy sells knowledge, Vale hoarded it. He was a man who counted silence, which is but another way of counting opportunity. Consider, in a market where fortunes turn upon, minutes to know when a line is cleared for a special transmission is to know when news will break. If one times a purchase to that invisible rhythm, he holds the whip hand over slower men. I confess the notion startled me. That silence itself might be a commodity to be bought and measured seemed the most diabolical refinement of speculation I had yet heard. Then Vale's killer, I said, was one who wished to steal his advantage or to prevent him using it. Holmes's smile was thin. Exactly. And which of his acquaintances profits most directly by denying him that advantage? His partner, Mr. Prentice, whose denials just now were too smoothly rehearsed. Yet let us not run before the hounds. A shadow may resemble a man until the lantern shifts. At that moment, Finch, the manservant, tapped discreetly and announced that a caller waited below. A Mr. Alton, clerk to the firm, who had heard of his employer's death. Holmes signalled for him to be shown in. The man entered with the air of one torn between grief and calculation. He was younger than I expected, no more than 25, with spectacles that magnified a pair of quick, darting eyes. His morning cravat was already perfectly tied, which suggested forethought. "You were close to Mr. Vale?" Holmes asked gently. "Sir, I kept his books, corrected his figures, and, if I may say so, understood his ways better than Mr. Prentice did." The young man's voice trembled, though whether from sorrow or eagerness I could not tell. He was secretive, but he trusted me with his private notes. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "Private notes, indeed. You will oblige me by describing them." The clerk coloured faintly. "Columns of numbers, sir, and little marks like scores upon a slate. He said they were exercises to sharpen the attention. He could listen to a room and tell you how many words were spoken, how many seconds passed between. He called it counting the silence." "And did he mention," Holmes pressed, "the origin of those silences?" The clerk hesitated. "Once. He said silence was the purest signal, that when others were deaf he was most alert. But, sir, if you suggest—" He faltered, twisting his gloves. Holmes let him dangle. At last the young man whispered, "There are rumours, sir, that gentlemen of finance can arrange a quiet upon the wire, that when all messages halt, something vital is passing elsewhere. Mr. Vale, he never said so plain, but I think he was listening for such pauses." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, Mr. Alton, that is all for now." When the clerk had departed, Lestrade burst out, "Then it's plain as a pikestaff. Prentice or one of his gang wanted Vale's secret silenced along with him. We'll have him in irons by nightfall." Holmes gave a little sigh. "Patience, Lestrade. A net cast too quickly catches weeds. No, we must first discover how the silence was forged and by whose hand. For the one who smothered London's voice at 6:31 smothered Vale at the same instant. That man may serve Prentice, or may serve another altogether. Until we know which, arrest is premature." He drew on his gloves, his face bright with anticipation. "Come, Watson. Our path lies now to the General Post Office. There we shall learn whose hand signed the counterfeit order, and whether our murderer be a master of wires or merely their employer. Only then shall the figure behind this dreadful arithmetic reveal itself." The General Post Office loomed over St. Martin's-le-Grand like some massive temple of industry, its colonnaded front crowded with clerks and messengers, hurrying in and out beneath the drizzle. We passed through the echoing hall, where the ceaseless clatter of typewriters and the shuffling of boots produced a kind of droning background hum. Holmes, his hat tilted low and his eyes gleaming with suppressed excitement, moved with unerring precision toward a narrow stair marked Telegraph Department. Lestrade followed stiffly, muttering about warrants, but Holmes had already drawn from his pocket a folded card that bore the crimson crest of the Home Office. A clerk of nervous disposition admitted us into a small room where the walls were hung with maps of the country, strung with black lines that converged like veins upon London. At a high desk, spectacles glinting beneath the gas lamp, sat a man of middle years whose face bore the pinched look of one accustomed to living among codes and reports rather than men. He rose when Holmes introduced himself, and though he frowned at Lestrade, he seemed half inclined to treat Holmes as a colleague. "You inquire about silence number 47, he said at once, anticipating our errand. "Yes, the order was received here at 6:31 this morning, and relayed to the district offices. The stamp upon it was that of Inspector Grieve." "Yet Inspector Grieve was at Charing Cross," Holmes said lightly, "which means that his authority was borrowed. Show me the message itself." The man adjusted his spectacles, drew out a thin slip of yellow paper from a file, and laid it upon the desk. Holmes bent over it with keen interest. The form was perfectly executed. The red oval stamp, the initials GR, the code number. Yet after only a glance, Holmes produced his magnifying lens, and with a soft exhalation of triumph he tapped at the ink. "You see, Watson, the edges of the letters are feathery, as though bled into the fibres. The post office uses a specially compounded ink that bites sharply and leaves a crisp outline. This is an imitation, written with common commercial ink. And note, Grieve's usual flourish upon the G is absent. Someone copied his hand, but without knowing the unconscious habits that give a signature life." The official's face hardened. "Forgery, then?" Holmes straightened. "Forgery, yes, but not the clumsy sort. Whoever wrote this had access to a sample of Grieve's signature and knew the form of the order precisely. That restricts our quarry to a very narrow circle. Someone who either serves in your department or has purchased the knowledge from one who does. Lestrade seized upon the words. Then we'll have your list of clerks, sir. Every one of them. The official bristled but produced a register nonetheless. Holmes ran a long finger down the column of names, pausing now and then with that peculiar stillness that suggested an inward reckoning. At last he tapped upon one. Arthur Crail, he murmured. Telegraph engineer attached to Bloomsbury district, noted for his skill in testing circuits. Suspended for 3 weeks last year upon a charge of negligence, though reinstated after protest. He looked up and his eyes met mine with the glint of certainty. Watson, you recall the varnish upon the muffin man's gentleman, the gutta-percha trace upon the clock? Those are the tools of an engineer, not a desk clerk. I would stake my reputation that Arthur Crail walked Vale Street this morning. Lestrade was already scribbling in his book. We'll have him in custody by nightfall. Holmes shook his head. Again, too swift. Let him believe himself unsuspected. A frightened bird will take flight before we can see where it nests. Better to watch him and discover what tree he returns to. For I tell you this, Lestrade, Crail is no solitary villain. He is but the instrument. Someone held the purse that paid for silence, and that man is the true architect of Vale's death. The inspector grumbled, but Holmes was already leading the way back into the hall, where the clatter and hum seemed louder than ever. He stood for a moment, drawing at his pipe, while the smoke curled upward in pale rings. Do you mark it, Watson? London is never still. Its voice is ceaseless, until some hand dares to cut it off. To command silence here is to wield a weapon as sharp as any dagger. We returned to Baker Street with the rain in our faces. Once ensconced before the fire, Holmes set the strip of Vale's telegraph paper upon the table and studied it in silence, his brows drawn together. 6:31 to 6:37. That was the gap. During that gap, Vale was silenced also. He had grown too close, perhaps, to understanding the rhythm of those pauses. He was a man learning to read the Empire's pulse, and another feared he might speak of it. I ventured to ask whether he suspected Prentice directly. Holmes blew a thin plume of smoke. Prentice profits most clearly. But suspicion is not proof. Until I catch the thread that binds Prentice to Crail, I shall not speak. Still, I think you will find that Vale was murdered not for what he knew already, but for what he was about to know. That evening, while the lamps glowed upon the wet pavements, a telegram arrived, hand-delivered by a breathless boy. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. Arthur Crail sighted at warehouse near Holborn, frequenting after hours no clear purpose. Reported by plainclothesman. Holmes's eyes glittered. Excellent. The net begins to tighten. Watson, fetch your coat. Tonight we shall hear what song a man of silence sings when he believes no ear is near. And so, within the hour, we found ourselves in a narrow street off Holborn, the wet stones shining like mirrors under the lamps. Holmes drew me into the shadow of a doorway opposite a shuttered warehouse, whose roof rose black against the glimmering sky. From within came no sound, yet Holmes laid a finger upon his lips, and I realized that he was not listening for noise but for the absence of it. For a long moment, the city's symphony, the wheels, the voices, the distant rumble of trains, seemed to recede, and there was only the taut hush of expectation. Then, faint as the tick of a clock muffled in cloth, came the tapping of a telegraph key. Holmes leaned close and whispered, "Our engineer is at work, Watson, but the message he sends is not to the yard. It is to the one who paid for silence." The faint staccato inside the warehouse carried across the wet stones like a heartbeat muffled in cloth. Holmes pressed me further into the shadows, his profile taut with concentration. He raised one gloved hand and mimicked the rhythm in the air with forefinger and thumb, each flick timed to the invisible beats of the telegraph key. I could scarcely follow, but I saw in his narrowing eyes that he caught the drift of it. A crude cipher, he breathed. No attempt to conceal the hand, merely abbreviations and figures. "Listen, Watson, see delivered, and paid. Partner waits. The fool is confessing with every tap." "Then let us take him now," I whispered urgently. Holmes shook his head, the ghost of a smile flickering. "No, my dear fellow. The key is not his guilt alone, but the direction it points. He reports to another. We must see to whom the reply comes." So we waited, the drizzle cooling upon our shoulders, while the steady tapping ceased and silence fell heavy in the street. Holmes's head tilted, his nostrils flaring. Then, after a long pause, another rhythm answered, fainter, distant, travelling along the line like an echo borne on a taut wire. Holmes translated under his breath, each word falling like a gavel. Continue watch. Vale ended. Next phase requires caution. Meet usual place, dawn. The sound stopped. A door grated within the warehouse, and light spilled through a narrow crack before vanishing again. Footsteps approached the threshold. Holmes tugged at my sleeve, and we slipped into the lee of the wall just as a figure emerged. Arthur Crail was as Holmes had surmised, a lean man in a dark coat, with gloves that squeaked faintly as he pulled them tighter against the wet. He carried a satchel from which protruded the tip of a coiled wire. His stick struck the curb with that peculiar hollow ring of hard rubber. He glanced about, and for one perilous second his gaze swept past our hiding place. Then, satisfied, he strode quickly down the lane. "Come, Watson," Holmes murmured, and we followed at a discreet distance. Crail led us into Holborn proper, where the press of hansoms and the hiss of rain upon the lamps half concealed our pursuit. He turned sharply into a narrower street lined with shuttered shops, finally halting before a coffee-house, whose upper windows glowed faintly despite the hour. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. "The usual place, Watson. Observe how a man betrays himself by habit. Let him enter. We shall learn who awaits him." Crail mounted the step, rapped softly, and was admitted. Holmes did not follow at once. Instead, he drew me back into a recessed doorway opposite, where we could see the interior through a gap in the curtains. The coffee-house was nearly deserted, save for a tall gentleman seated near the fire, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Crail bent low to him, producing from his satchel a small bundle which he laid upon the table. The other examined it briefly, then pushed across a purse whose clink carried even through the window panes. Holmes's lips tightened. "Payment upon delivery. But what does the bundle contain? See?" Vale's notebook stripped from his desk. "Our engineer is but a thief in service of the master." I craned to glimpse the gentleman more clearly. He shifted, and for a fleeting instant the lamplight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the sheen of his coat. My breath caught. "Holmes, it is Lucian Prentice!" Holmes inclined his head, not in triumph, but in grim confirmation. "Yes, the partner profits, as logic dictated, but let us gather rope enough before we cast it. A direct accusation now would see him slip free with ease. We must bind Crail's hand to his purse and the purse to Vale's silence." Inside, the men spoke in hushed tones. We could catch no words, but Holmes's keen eyes devoured every gesture. At last Prentice rose, handed Crail a folded paper, and departed with the same easy assurance he had shown in Vale's study. Crail remained only long enough to drain a cup of coffee, then slunk out by a side door into the night. Holmes touched my arm. "We follow Prentice. Crail will keep. The greater fish is on the move." We trailed the banker across Holborn and along into Bloomsbury, where the gas lamps flared in the mist. He walked briskly as one intent upon some secret errand until he reached the steps of a tall house whose windows were shuttered despite the hour not yet striking midnight. He gave a coded knock, and the door admitted him without hesitation. Holmes exhaled softly. "Mark the address, Watson. Russell Square, number 31. A house dark to the street but alive within. That is his true sanctum. There lies the thread that binds Crail's wire to Vale's grave." We lingered a few minutes more, but no further movement stirred. Holmes at last tugged my sleeve. "Enough for tonight. To press further would be to rattle the cage. We have learned the partnership, the payment, and the lair. Tomorrow we must draw the cord tighter." As we retraced our steps, I asked whether Lestrade should be informed at once. Holmes shook his head. "Patience, Watson. Evidence must be woven, not flung. Vale died because he counted the silence, and his killer believed silence unanswerable. Let us prove him wrong. We shall let the silence speak against him, and when it does, the voice of London itself will cry his guilt." We returned to Baker Street in the small hours, our boots wet through and our minds aflame with the secret we had glimpsed. Holmes threw himself into his chair, lit his pipe, and stared into the smoke. "It is nearly complete, Watson. One missing fragment remains, the motive beyond mere profit. Why risk so audacious a scheme, when Vale was his partner already? That answer lies in the figures Vale wrote, in the strange arithmetic of absence. Once we decipher that, the rest will follow. I saw his gaze burn upon the telegraph slip recovered from Vale's recess, and I knew that until morning, the silence of Baker Street would be broken only by the steady scratch of Holmes's pen and the long, patient rhythm of his deductions. Holmes was still at his desk when I woke, the grey light of dawn creeping across the sitting room and catching in the haze of his smoke. Sheets of foolscap lay scattered about him, covered with columns of figures, lines of telegraphic symbols, and the occasional sharply written note in his narrow hand. He had the look of a man who had not slept, but had instead fed himself upon pure deduction through the night. "You see, Watson," he said without preamble, Vale had discovered a law of pauses. These silences on the line were not arbitrary. They were the pulse beats of information withheld, waiting to burst forth. He marked them with such precision that he could, by anticipating the resumption, be first to act upon what the market would soon learn. It was a formidable power, but only half-formed. What he lacked was the final key. Who created those silences and at what cost? "And Prentice?" I asked. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. Prentice knew that Vale was close. Too close. If the secret of purchased silence were exposed, it would ruin not only his schemes, but the entire circle of those who conspired with him. "You saw the purse pass to Crail. That is not a clerk's wage, it is hush money." At that moment a sharp knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, brisk but weary-eyed, carrying a bundle under his arm. "I took the liberty, Mr. Holmes," he said, "of setting a man to watch Crail after you left me yesterday. He followed him to a warehouse in Holborn, where you may have been yourselves, and later to a coffee house. This morning he caught him trying to pawn a silver watch engraved with the initials SV. The pawnbroker had the wit to send word to the Yard. We have Crail in custody." Holmes's eyes kindled, but he only said, "Excellent. Did you search his rooms?" "Indeed. And found this?" Lestrade laid the bundle upon the table. Inside were Vale's notebooks, each numbered in that clerkly hand, the pages filled with his strange tallies of seconds and strokes. Holmes bent over them eagerly, as I thought. "Here is the full series. Number 46 ends the day before his death. Number 47 unfinished. And in the margin of that last, do you see? A calculation half worked, a sum of tallies corresponding to the very silence which fell upon Bloomsbury at 6:31. Lestrade scratched his head. Then Vale found out that the pause had been ordered by forgery. "Is that it?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. He discovered only the regularity of the thing, the pattern. But he had begun to ask himself who profited. That was enough for Prentice to fear the rest." He straightened, his whole form animated with decision. "Lestrade, you must hold Crail without alerting Prentice. Charge him with the theft of the watch if you must, but keep the larger matter close. We shall use him as our lever." Lestrade frowned. "If he's guilty of murder, he should hang, and he shall if guilt proves to him. But Crail is more useful as a witness than as a corpse in Newgate. Leave him to me for an hour's conversation. Meanwhile, Watson and I will pay another call upon Mr. Prentice. His confidence is high. Let us shake it until the cracks show." By noon we were seated once more in the handsome offices of Prentice and Vale, where Lucian Prentice received us with that smooth courtesy which is half armour, half challenge. His dark eyes betrayed no unease, though Holmes's sudden visit might have unsettled a less practised man. "Mr. Holmes," he said, gesturing us to chairs, "I trust you have news of the fiend who robbed my partner of his life." Holmes regarded him lazily. "On the contrary, I have news of the fiend who robbed your partner of his notebooks." He produced one from his pocket and laid it upon the desk. "You recognize this, I'm sure." Prentice glanced at it without changing expression. "One of Vale's eccentricities. He was forever filling volumes with meaningless figures." Holmes's voice was almost conversational. "Yet those meaningless figures were purchased last night at a coffee house in Holborn for a purse of sovereigns, delivered by your own hand." For the first time a flicker crossed Prentice's face, gone almost before I marked it. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You mistake me, sir. I was not in Holborn. Holmes smiled faintly. "A denial too soon is an admission of memory. I have little doubt, Mr. Prentice, that when Crail is pressed he will recall the address of Russell Square. Shall we send Lestrade to call upon your acquaintances there?" The man's composure faltered. His fingers tightened, and for an instant the mask slipped, revealing the hardness beneath. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, You are a dangerous meddler. If you suppose the death of Vale to be other than an unfortunate seizure— Come, sir, Holmes interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp. The bruise at the base of the skull, the smothered clock, the strangled fire, these are not the accompaniments of apoplexy. Vale was silenced because he listened too well, and the wire that carried Creel's false order carried also your fortune. The silence that followed was like the hush before thunder. Prentice's lips curved in a thin smile, but his eyes had grown cold. You speak boldly, Mr. Holmes, but without proof your words are smoke. Do you think the law will take a banker upon hearsay? Holmes rose. Not yet. But smoke, when confined, becomes suffocation. I warn you, Prentice, the silence you purchased is ending. London itself is beginning to speak. We left him then, his smile still fixed, but his gaze following us with a venom that chilled me. Outside, Holmes drew a long breath. He is rattled, Watson. The fortress is not impregnable. Tonight we shall use Creel to breach it. For men who count silence forget that silence, too, can be broken, and with that he quickened his step towards Scotland Yard, his lean figure cutting through the fog like the point of a spear. At Scotland Yard we were shown into a bare interrogation room, where Arthur Creel sat upon a wooden chair, his wrists resting on the table, his gloves removed to reveal long fingers stained with oil and resin. He looked smaller without the cloak of darkness and secrecy, more a weary tradesman than the phantom who had silenced a street. Yet his eyes darted nervously at every sound in the corridor, as though the ticking of a clock might betray him. Holmes seated himself opposite with the composure of a man about to play a leisurely game of chess. He steepled his fingers and regarded Creel with a faint air of amusement. You are charged with theft, he began mildly. The pawning of a watch that belonged to Septimus Vale. That in itself may bring you 6 months of hard labor. But we both know it is not the heaviest weight upon your conscience. Creel swallowed hard, his lips twitching. I never touched him. He was gone when I— Holmes raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. Precisely. You are no murderer. Your hand is skilled in wires, not in death. And yet you stood in his study, did you not? You muffled the bell of the clock. You quenched the fire, you drew the silence around him like a cloak, not to kill but to conceal. Who gave you the order, Creel? The man shook his head violently. I can't. If I speak, they'll— Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. If you do not speak, the gallows will have you. Lestrade has the evidence to keep you behind bars until the trial, and when Prentice denies you, as he surely will, the rope will be yours alone. But if you tell us the truth, you may yet live to walk free, a witness instead of a scapegoat. For a long moment Creel stared at the table, his breath quick and shallow. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, It was Prentice. He came to me weeks ago. Said Vale was meddling, asking too many questions about the wire. He paid me to forge the order, to buy the silences when they were needed, so that their firm could profit before the market knew. Yesterday. His voice faltered, and he pressed his hands together as though in prayer. Yesterday he told me it must end. Vale had discovered too much. I was to arrange the quiet, to make it seem the whole street had slept while he died. And then I left him there. I never struck him. I swear it. Lestrade, who had been lurking by the door, gave a grunt of satisfaction. A fine confession. That will do for the jury. Holmes's expression was grave. It will not do for me. There is still the manner of death, a bruise at the base of the skull, the marks of smothering. Creel tells us only of silence, not of murder. He turned back to the engineer. Who entered the house, Creel? Who laid the final hand upon Vale? The man hesitated, then shook his head again. I never saw. I was outside by then. He said Prentice said it would be handled. My part was only the quiet. Holmes studied him for a long time, then rose abruptly. Keep him safe, Lestrade. Guard him as though he were the crown jewels. He is the thread that leads us straight to Prentice's hand. If harm comes to him before the trial, the truth will vanish with him. As we left the yard, the evening fog had thickened, wrapping London in a clammy shroud. Holmes walked swiftly, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed upon some inner horizon. We are close, Watson, he murmured. Prentice has overreached himself. Vale's notebooks, the forged order, the testimony of Creel all point to him. And yet, he halted suddenly, his face pale in the lamplight, and yet the final act eludes me. Why the bruise? Why the smothering? Prentice is a man of ledgers, not violence. He would not soil his own hands unless driven to desperation. Who then was the instrument of that last fatal silence? I ventured that perhaps Crail lied to spare himself. Holmes shook his head impatiently. No, he is too clumsy a liar. His fear is genuine. No, Watson. There is another hand at work, and until I find it, the picture is incomplete. Back at Baker Street, he paced restlessly before the fire, the smoke of his pipe curling like questions in the air. Suddenly, he snatched up Vale's final notebook and thrust it toward me. Read, Watson. Do you see what I see? The entries at 6:31, 6:34, 6:37. He writes, street falls quiet, clock silenced, fire dead, breath, and there it ends. He was recording not merely the silence of the wire, but the silence of his own chamber, as it was forced upon him. Someone stood over him at that very moment. Someone smothered him even as he wrote the word. That hand cannot have been Crail's, for Crail was outside arranging the false bell. Then who? I asked. Holmes's eyes flashed. The servant Finch, perhaps, with his careful grooming and motionless hands. Or the housekeeper, Mrs. Draper, who swore she heard nothing. Or... He stopped, and for an instant the mask of confidence slipped, revealing the fierce joy of the chase. Or Prentice himself, slipping in to finish what money and wires could not. At that moment a rap sounded at the door. A constable stood on the step, breathless from haste. Mr. Holmes, sir. Mr. Prentice has demanded to see Crail at the yard this very night. Claims to have evidence that clears him. Inspector Lestrade bade me fetch you at once. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He seized his coat and hat. So the fox grows bold. Come, Watson. Tonight the silence may at last speak its truth. The lamps of Scotland Yard burned late that evening, their glow turning the fog outside to a dull orange haze. Inside the air smelled of ink and damp wool. We were shown at once to a private chamber, where Lestrade awaited us, his features lined with suspicion. Across the table sat Lucian Prentice, immaculately turned out despite the hour, his gloves folded neatly before him, his expression one of calm disdain. Holmes entered without greeting, his sharp gaze sweeping the room before fastening on Prentice. You wish to see your accomplice, he said curtly. What do you hope to gain from it? Prentice allowed himself a small smile. Accomplice? No, Mr. Holmes, victim of circumstance. This man Crail is a thief who sought to enrich himself by stealing my late partner's papers. He now attempts to shield himself with calumny. I demand to confront him. My reputation is at stake, Lestrade bristled. Your reputation will have its day in court, sir. Till then you'll answer questions here. Holmes waved him down. Patience, Lestrade. Let us humor Mr. Prentice. Perhaps his eagerness will betray him. He turned toward the constable at the door. Bring Crail. A few moments later the engineer was led in, pale and trembling. At the sight of Prentice he recoiled as though from a striking serpent. Prentice, for his part, regarded him with icy indifference. You see, gentlemen, Prentice said smoothly, this is the fellow you would set against me. Look at him. A weak creature, easily bribed, easily frightened. He forged Vale's notes, no doubt, and now seeks to sell you his lies. Crail's voice shook. It's not lies. You paid me, Prentice. Paid me to forge Greaves' signature, to order silences on the line. You told me Vale had to be stopped. Vale had to be stopped. Prentice leaned back, folding his arms. And where is your proof? Holmes stepped forward. Here, he said, producing from his pocket the scrap of paper we had seen exchanged in the coffee house. This note, given by your hand to Crail, directs him to Russell Square. The handwriting is yours, and the ink matches that of your office. A trifling proof, perhaps, but damning enough when coupled with the testimony of those who saw you enter that house. For the first time, Prentice's composure faltered. His jaw tightened and a flush rose in his cheeks. You overreach, Holmes. That note proves nothing. And even if I did meet him, what of it? Business requires many meetings. Holmes's voice was cold steel. Business does not require silence brought upon the wires. Business does not require a partner struck down in his own study. Shall I tell you how it was done? You feared Vale's discovery of your schemes. You arranged the silence through Crail. You smothered every witness. The clock, the fire, the street, and you entered that chamber to make certain Vale would never speak. The bruise upon his skull is the mark of your cane, delivered as he bent over his notes. The cloth upon his face was your final act, sealing the silence you had purchased. The room held its breath. Prentice's eyes glittered dangerously. Fine theatre, Mr. Holmes, but still only words. You have no witness to place me in that room. Holmes's lips curved. On the contrary, Vale himself witnessed you. His final word was left upon the blotter, breath warm, broken, unfinished, as you smothered him. But beside it, impressed faintly into the paper, lies the mark of your signet ring. I took the liberty of examining it this afternoon when you toyed with it in your office. The impression matches exactly. That, Mr. Prentice, is proof no jury can ignore. A silence deeper than any Vale had counted filled the chamber. Prentice stared at Holmes, his face drained of colour. His hand moved instinctively toward his ring, then fell back to the table. For a long moment he said nothing. Then with sudden fury he struck the table so hard the inkpot leapt. "Damn you, Holmes. Always meddling, always prying." Yes, I silenced him. He would have ruined us all, exposed what must remain hidden. The markets are wars as bloody as any battlefield. Vale grew weak, sentimental. I could not permit it. He counted the silence, but he forgot that silence has its price. Lestrade sprang forward, clapping irons upon his wrists, even as the confession echoed in the chamber. Prentice offered no resistance, only sat back with a twisted smile. "You may have won, Holmes, but others will rise where I fall. You cannot silence the city." Holmes regarded him with a look of mingled contempt and pity. "No, Prentice. The city will speak, and it will speak against you." As he was led away, Crail slumped in his chair, relief flooding his features. Holmes touched his shoulder briefly. "Your guilt remains, Crail, but the law will temper its justice with your testimony. See that you use your freedom more wisely than you used your skill." Outside, the fog had thinned, and the bells of St. Paul's rang faintly across the river. Holmes drew a deep breath, his sharp profile etched against the lamplight. "So ends the case of the man who counted the silence, Watson. A curious lesson. That absence may be as deadly as presence. That silence itself can be forged into a weapon. Vale heard it, measured it, and died by it. Let us return home. I find I am weary of silence tonight." And so we walked back through the waking streets, the city's ceaseless murmur rising once more around us, as though London itself rejoiced in having broken its enforced hush. Holmes strode at my side, thoughtful, but with the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his eye, while I reflected with awe on how his genius had once again plucked the truth from the very heart of mystery. The following morning broke sharp and clear, as though the fog itself had been lifted by the events of the night. London bustled once more with its customary rhythm, the rattle of wheels, the cries of hawkers, the calls of newsboys proclaiming the arrest of a prominent banker. At Baker Street, Holmes had cast aside the weariness I had glimpsed the evening before, and was now seated in his armchair, pipe in hand, an expression of detached contentment upon his features. "You see, Watson," he remarked as I set aside the newspaper, "the city has recovered its voice. Its silence is no longer purchased, its pulse no longer checked." For one brief interval, Prentice believed himself master of the wires, commander of the pauses that rule the markets. Yet in truth he was no conductor, only a player whose notes jarred against the harmony of the whole. I could not help but feel a surge of admiration. "Still, Holmes, your reasoning was extraordinary. To follow the thread from a muffled clock to a forged order, from a street grown silent to the bruise upon a dead man's skull, such a chain would have baffled any other mind." He waved a hand dismissively. "It was all there, Watson. The difficulty lay not in the facts, but in arranging them in their natural sequence. Once I recognized that silence was itself the commodity, the rest followed. A curious case, unique in fact, in which absence spoke louder than presence. Just then Mrs. Hudson appeared with a card upon a tray. "A gentleman to see you, sir," she said. Holmes glanced at the card and raised an eyebrow. "Inspector Grieve of the Telegraph Office," he announced. "Show him in." The inspector entered, a stout, ruddy man with a frank gaze, clearly unused to being dragged into scandal. He shook Holmes's hand warmly. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you thanks. My name was forged in this vile business, and but for your investigation my honor might have suffered irreparably." Holmes inclined his head. "The forgery was bold, Inspector, but too smooth to be genuine. Your true hand bears the unconscious grace of long habit, something no imitator could counterfeit. You may rest assured your reputation is untarnished." Grieve's expression hardened. "I only regret that such knowledge of our codes and stamps was ever allowed to fall into unscrupulous hands. Measures will be taken, I promise you. Never again shall a silence be ordered without double verification." "An excellent resolve," Holmes said. "For if one lesson is to be drawn from this affair, it is that even silence must be made accountable." When Grieve had gone, Holmes rose and began pacing the room, his long fingers twirling the stem of his pipe. "There remains but one shadow to dispel, Watson. The fate of Arthur Crail. He is guilty, yes, of complicity and theft, but he was in the end an instrument wielded by stronger hands. I shall speak for him to the court. Let him serve his sentence, but not swing for a crime that was never his." I agreed that mercy was just in such a case, though I could not wholly absolve the man who had silenced a city street at another's bidding. Holmes halted at the window, gazing down upon the morning traffic. "And as for Prentice, he will stand trial. The law will not overlook his confession, nor the damning imprint of his ring upon Vale's blotter. It is a reminder, Watson, that even the most guarded hand leaves a trace if one but looks closely enough. In the days that followed, the newspapers were filled with the affair. The financial world reeled at the exposure of a scheme so audacious, while the public marveled at the manner of its detection. Some praised Holmes as the savior of the markets, others denounced Prentice as a traitor to honest commerce. Yet through all the clamor, one fact shone clear. The silence Vale had counted had at last been broken. One evening, as we sat quietly with the fire crackling, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he took satisfaction in the admiration now heaped upon him. He looked at me with that mixture of irony and gentleness which so often tempered his words. "My dear fellow, admiration is a passing wind. What lingers is the intellectual pleasure of the chase, the joy of disentangling a skein that others believe hopelessly knotted. I do not seek applause, but understanding, and in this case I found both challenge and reward. What more could I ask? I could not help but smile. "Then you will forgive me if I record the adventure in my own modest fashion? The public may not grasp every deduction, but they will relish the drama." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "As you will, Watson. Only do not paint me too brightly. A splash of shadow lends contrast to the light. Leave them guessing whether Holmes is admirable or insufferable. That is, after all, the truth. The firelight flickered across his austere features, softening them for an instant. Outside, London hummed with its ceaseless noise, a city that had survived another attempt to bind its tongue. And I, who had seen Holmes wrest meaning from silence itself, knew that I would never again hear the hush of a paused street or the stillness of a muffled clock without recalling the strange and terrible case of the man who counted the silence. Holmes, seeing my thoughtful gaze, leaned back with a faint smile. "Come, Watson. Enough of silence and its reckonings. Fetch the chessboard. I am inclined tonight for a battle that leaves no widows and enriches no bankers, only the vanity of the victor." And as I set the pieces upon the board, I reflected that there was no silence more welcome than the companionable one which falls between friends, a silence unbought, unforced, and filled with the quiet certainty of trust. The trial of Lucian Prentice drew the city's attention as few trials had done in recent years. Every broadsheet carried bold lines of speculation. Bankers and brokers whispered anxiously in their clubs, and in the courts, the public pressed so closely to hear the evidence that more than one constable was forced to drive the crowd back with stern warnings. Holmes and I attended the opening session, seated discreetly in the gallery. He observed the proceedings with that same detached calm he had shown at the scene of Vale's death, his hands folded, his eyes narrowing only when a witness misspoke or a counsel pressed too eagerly. Arthur Crail, pale but resolute, gave his testimony first. He spoke of the forged orders, of the silences arranged upon the line, of the purse passed to him in the Holborn coffee-house. His voice trembled when he named Prentice, but steadied as Holmes caught his eye and inclined his head in silent encouragement. The court murmured at his words, and I could see the jurymen lean forward, their attention sharpened by the novelty of such a crime, that silence itself could be bought and turned to profit. Prentice, when his turn came, conducted himself with icy composure. His counsel argued that Crail was a desperate man, seeking to shift blame from himself, that the notebooks of Vale were the eccentric ramblings of a mind unhinged, and that the so-called confession at the yard was the outburst of a man goaded past endurance. Yet the evidence Holmes had so carefully gathered stood firm, the false order in Prentice's hand, the purse of sovereigns, the impression of his signet ring pressed into the blotter at the moment of Vale's death. Piece by piece the noose of circumstance drew tight. During an interval I remarked upon this to Holmes. He only shook his head. "The law loves its proofs, Watson, but I find little joy in the spectacle. Prentice is already defeated. The greater fascination lies in the idea itself, that a man might measure absence as others measure sound, and from it divine profit or ruin. Vale's genius was twisted but remarkable nonetheless. I asked whether he thought such practices would end with Prentice's conviction. Holmes's smile was bitter. Hardly. The world is full of men who will pay for an advantage and others who will sell it. But London has learned that silence can betray as surely as speech. That knowledge alone may deter the more timid. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty of murder. Prentice received it without visible reaction, though his jaw tightened as the sentence of death was pronounced. He turned once toward the gallery, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it fell upon Holmes. For an instant hatred flared, naked and unguarded. Then his eyes dropped and he was led away. Outside, the press of the crowd was almost suffocating. Newsboys shouted the sentence. Brokers hurried to reassure clients, and the curious thronged every carriage. Holmes shouldered through with little regard, his lean figure cutting a path until at last we emerged into a quieter street. He drew a long breath and let it out with a wry chuckle. So ends another chapter in the annals of human folly, Watson. And yet I cannot help but feel that Vale himself remains the most curious figure of all. A man who heard what others could not, who counted the silences of a city as one might count the stars. That evening, back at Baker Street, he set Vale's final notebook upon the mantel. "I shall keep this," he said softly, "not as evidence but as a reminder. There is a poetry in those tallies, however grim. They remind me that truth often lies not in what is spoken, but in what is withheld." I watched him in the firelight, his features softened by reflection. It struck me then that, for all his brilliance, Holmes lived much as Vale had, attuned to what others missed, isolated by the very clarity of his perception. Yet where Vale had been consumed, Holmes thrived, drawing vitality from the chase rather than despair. The days passed, and the case gradually slipped from public memory, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip. Yet for us it lingered. More than once, when London's bustle stilled unexpectedly, I saw Holmes pause, his head cocked as though measuring the length of the silence, weighing its meaning. Then he would smile faintly and resume his step, content that this time no hand had purchased the hush. One late afternoon, as the winter sun faded, I found him seated by the window, the chessboard untouched between us. He looked out at the street, where children played noisily and a costermonger shouted his wares. "Listen, Watson," he said suddenly. "The city speaks. It speaks endlessly, sometimes foolishly, sometimes cruelly, but always with life. Never forget that silence, too, has its voice. Vale knew it. Prentice tried to exploit it, and we must learn to hear it without being mastered by it." I nodded, struck by the quiet gravity of his words. For once, no deduction followed, no leap of logic or triumphant declaration, only the calm reflection of a man who had wrestled with silence and uncovered its deadly potential. And so the case of the man who counted the silence passed into our chronicles, another chapter in the long record of Holmes's triumphs. Yet whenever I take up my pen to set it down, I hear again the faint scratching of Vale's last word upon the blotter, broken and unfinished, and I shudder to think how narrow the margin is between sound and its absence, between life and the silence that ends all counting. The weeks following Prentice's conviction saw life at Baker Street return to its customary rhythm, though I often caught Holmes in moments of abstraction, his gaze fixed on the thin notebook he had chosen to preserve. It lay upon the mantel like a relic, Vale's final testimony written in the silent language he alone had learned to hear. One evening, as we sat together over coffee, I asked whether the case had given him any unusual satisfaction. He stirred his cup idly, then looked at me with that peculiar blend of irony and candor that so often marked his moods. "Satisfaction, Watson? Insofar as justice was done, yes. But you know me too well to suppose I rejoice in the gallows. What lingers with me is the curious intellect of Vale." He turned his ear to the spaces between, sought knowledge where others heard nothing. There is tragedy in such genius, unused, misunderstood, destroyed by the very mind it threatened. I ventured that Prentice was, at least, unmasked and punished. Holmes gave a dry smile. Prentice was never the true adversary. He was a merchant who mistook silence for gold. The greater adversary is always folly, the human conviction that profit justifies every artifice. In this instance, Folly clothed itself in respectability and nearly triumphed. That it failed is due less to me than to the fact that silence, however artfully contrived, leaves marks of its own. A muffled clock, a quenched fire, an unfinished word, such things speak loudly to those who listen. The fire crackled, and outside the clatter of wheels and voices drifted up from Baker Street, reassuring in its commonness. Holmes leaned back, the shadow of weariness crossing his features. "The city hums again, Watson, and I am glad of it. I have had my fill of silence. Let others chase its profits. I shall content myself with sound deductions." He closed his eyes, the faintest smile upon his lips, and I thought how strange it was that a man so attuned to the smallest absence should be, in his own way, the most vital voice in London. Thus ended the affair of the man who counted the silence, an adventure that taught me, more than any other, that even in the heart of a roaring city, silence may be the deadliest clue of all. And as I set down my pen, I hear Holmes's voice once more, sharp, amused, inexorable, reminding me that nothing in this world, not even the absence of sound, can truly escape detection.